everybody. Welcome to the Tamarack webinar, The Power of One, the Role of an Individual in Systems Change. My name's Liz Weaver, and I'm the co-CEO of Tamarack Institute. It's my pleasure to introduce this discussion and to welcome our guest for today, Cameron Norman. So welcome, Cameron.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. It's great to be here. Great to see you too.
Yeah, nice to see you as well. I'm going to introduce Cameron briefly. And then we'll get into the conversation. In the interim, Duncan, if we could go back one slide, we'd love to have people who have joined us go into the chat box and give us a little bit of a sense of how your work and COVID-19 have shifted your work over the last little while. We're really interested in this question at Tamarack, and so would love to hear a little bit more about that. So please put it in the chat box and we'll share some of the conversation both during this webinar and post-webinar. So let me go on to introduce you, Cameron. So Cameron Norman is the principal and president of Cense Ltd. He brings more than 20 years experience as a psychologist, an educator, a scientist, an evaluator, and a designer to the challenge of innovation in human systems and services. Cameron is an award-winning educator, serves as an adjunct professor at the Dalla Lana School of Public Health at the University of Toronto, and is a lecturer in the Faculty of Design at OCAD University, also in Toronto. So welcome, Cameron, to the webinar. You and I know each other. I mean, we met, probably about 5 or 6 years ago now, and I'm a big fan and follower of your work. And so really excited to have you joining us.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Liz. You know, it's great. And I think that the feeling is mutual because it's nice. This is a good testament to that spirit of community, because you start to learn from other people, and every time you see like a tweet or something like that, you're like, oh, that's really exciting, and what am I going to learn today? So that's really great.
Yeah, I think both you and I are big Twitter fans, and so we put lots of stuff up there. So you can follow either Cameron or me on Twitter, and Duncan will put the links to our Twitter handles in the chat box. So before we go into the conversation, maybe we can let people know who's joining us today. So we had more than 700 learners register for this workshop, and they come from Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Singapore, France, Spain, Brazil, Ethiopia, Indonesia, and beyond. And if we haven't mentioned your country, please let us know and put your name in the chat box and let us know where you've come from. But it's quite interesting to see how we have this kind of global spread for this webinar.
Yeah.
We're also really interested to know that there's a nice mix of sectors in this virtual room. So we have those of you from the nonprofit sector or the community-based sector, some folks from government and education. We have folks from philanthropy and foundations, from health, and I know you do a lot of work in the health sector, education, and consulting. So it's also a nice kind of mix of perspectives, and we're really looking to try to make this as interactive as possible given the limitations of Zoom. So we're hoping that you will, as you're listening to the conversation with Cameron and I, that you're putting questions into the chat box, or you're putting your ideas or your perspectives, or any resources or tools that you think might be helpful for our shared learning. Please do so, and we'll gather all of those together. So now I think we'll begin with our first question. And so Cameron, I did a bit of an introduction about you, but I wonder if you might share a little bit about yourself and your work, and how the pandemic has impacted the work of Cense.ca.
Yeah. Well, thanks. It's funny. I jokingly like to think this is the kind of situation where I go, my time has come, because I'm an unusual, like a lot of us, but I mean, I've got an unusual background, is that I originally trained as a psychologist. And most times when you think about psychology, it's usually about individuals, which is interesting, but I was interested in community psychology. So I studied that community and organizations, and practice that. And but with also an eye to complexity. So I'm interested in the systems thinking stuff, and then as I started to put all those things together, I find myself then also thinking, well, yeah, but we also need to create things. So I went to school and did some design work. And what I do now is kind of bring all of those things back together all at once. So most of what I do is consulting with organizations who are, it's really innovation. It's innovation consulting. So they're trying to look to do something different. They're trying to make change. Really, that's the psychology part. The design part is the how do you create it in terms of, kind of practice. And the systems is always important because that's really the environment that we're working in. And so I work with a lot of different organizations, healthcare, nonprofits, and governments who are like, we've never done anything before like this before. We're in a situation we've never done it before. Let's, how do we think about that in a new way? And how do we create things that are going to be effective in that environment? And I guess the last piece of what I do is a lot of evaluation, which, it's funny because when you start out with evaluation, it's not usually the thing that people like to, people get really excited by evaluation. I often joke is this the longest 4-letter word in the English language because usually it's done to you, but really that's a feedback thing. So, when this pandemic came, all of a sudden I'm like, okay, I guess this is what I've kind of set myself up for. Not intentionally, but this is the kind of environments that I often work on. This is a bit much that's going on right now, but it's that kind of stuff that I spend a lot of my time doing it. So I've actually found the pandemic time to be quite creative. I mean, people who are watching might know I had some surgery while this is all happening, so it's kind of limited things a little bit, but it's been quite a creative time, and also with that sensitivity to everything that's going on, for everyone, and so it's been interesting. It's been interesting. The people that I'm working with are asking the kind of questions that I've often always been working with them, but now they're asking them almost in a bigger way, like if that makes sense.
Wow, that's really interesting. I do think this has opened us up to looking at, what are the things that are shifting and how are we part of it? And I think, even though we had planned this webinar before the pandemic, the timing is really perfect. So if we go on to the next question, really, in one of your posts, you, and I was really intrigued by this idea, right? So in one of your posts on your website about acting in complex times, you provided some advice about navigating complexity, right? And I think that's what we're all trying to do with our post-pandemic world. And in that post, you talked about this notion of the smallest visible system. And so maybe tell us a little bit more about that and how you've come into thinking about the smallest visible system.
Yeah, so it's so funny because I tell you about this background. It's kind of about communities and organizations and that sort of stuff like this. And yet at the end, I sort of come back a little bit also to that roots in what, psychology tends to focus on as individuals. It's a very inefficient way to do things. If we focus on just every individual in the world, like it's going to take us a lot of energy. It's, nobody knows better than Tamarack about the power of community, but there's times when that actually becomes quite important. And it's so funny because of just the pandemic coming along after we've started our conversation and that post, I think came out. But one of the things that is important, particularly in a complex situation, is where you need to be able to communicate well with people. We often talk about shared vision. And in fact, one of the things that's been really interesting about this pandemic is that I think it's called into question a lot of the shared visions we've had. And I don't mean that in any negative way, that everything's wrong or everything's right. But, even a word like community, boy, does that mean something different now than it did just 2 or 3 months ago. And it's actually much more richer and more layered. What does home mean? Home means something so much different than it used to. And one of the things that I was talking about in that article was that post was oftentimes when you have so much going on and a lot of different signals coming in from different places, and it's difficult to make sense of things. And right now is a great example. Like people often ask, well, how are you doing? And, we did, and I'm like, well, good or
Yeah.
fine. It's kind of hard because we don't have the same basis of comparison that we did often before. And what often happens is that these, our ability to take these kind of big macro level ideas and bring them down to what does it mean for me and what I can do right now gets lost if that meaning doesn't have the same meaning it once did. And what I think we're doing now is we're starting to try and figure out what does even the smallest thing that we're doing, how do we make sense of that? So when there's so much going on, and what the smallest visible system does is allows us to really learn about what's going on right now. Like, even if you think about the most rudimentary things like grocery shopping now, that has gone from being a relatively simple or complicated thing to actually something that could be enormously complex, because you now have to think well in advance about what it is that you want. Who are you feeding? Are you feeding yourself and others outside your home? And then how many trips are you going to make? And are you going to order it online? And can you even do that? And what are the substitutions? All of that stuff means that all of that becomes much more complicated. And I think what this has done is a smallest visible system is that what are the boundaries of the system that I'm talking about right now, about this particular task, and what's going on. And if we use that grocery store example, is that I know just personally, my experience of getting groceries from the first day that things really started to go a bit funny, where you started to see, I was actually in the lineup at the grocery store. I'd already planned to go, and I'm literally probably 100th in line like that day. But I needed the groceries anyway, so it wasn't a rush thing. But I think about that, and I think of every order and every time I've gone to get food since then, it's changed. So what a smallest visible system is trying to figure out, what is that system that I can, like, I don't have control over toilet paper or yeast or all of these things. So what does it mean for me? And I think one of the things that does is it allows us to get some feedback when everything else is moving so much. It's so easy to get overwhelmed. If we think about, well, what is my community looking like? Well, my community is changing so much. So it dials it back to the point of saying, well, what are the things that I don't want to say control, but influence and really see. And so I can start to build a bit of a language for myself. So it makes it easier for me to talk to other people and say, this is what's kind of going on for me and it might be your household. Now I'm starting to understand what the rhythms are like, what I'm like, what, the people I interact with are like, that sort of thing. And it makes it easier for me to talk to my neighbors about what their experience is like. And so we can start to develop a bit of a shared language, because, in a time like this, I don't think we can go back to the language we were using before, because it doesn't mean the same thing. Like we're having to create some new language around things. And it might, that new language might look exactly like the old language. I mean, that's quite possible, but that's really what it meant about. It's really starting to think about all this complexity, because right now it's too easy to get overwhelmed. Like all you have to do is turn on the news. Like you're thinking, well, should I be paying attention to the fact is there's a spike in cases in Singapore? I don't know. Does that matter? Does it matter that there's something happening in Manitoba, my neighboring province? Does it matter? I mean, like, it's so hard to tell, and it's overwhelming us. And I think one of the things that this does is it also allows us just a little bit of control. That's not quite the right word, but it's a little bit of influence, and really to get better feedback from what it is that's going on, in our immediate world.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. We're going to invite people to maybe post about their smallest visible system and what how that thinking might shift their perspective. But I think about it from the perspective of our team at Tamarack, right? And one of the things that we have paid much more attention to in the very short term is increasing the amount of connectedness that we have with our team and sub-teams, and really being as transparent as we can be from a leadership perspective about, what's going on, what are the implications for our team, how are our team members feeling. We've kind of come now into this almost recovery. We've gone through response and we're entering into recovery, and it's really now saying, okay, so how do we start to pivot into what might come next, right? And so I think for us, this notion of a small visible system is really looking looking inwardly to our team. And just like you're, providing the
Yeah.
grocery example or the home example, I think we can also look at, the teams that we work with or the small networks that we support, and really think about it in that way. And I think it would be cool to find out what people, if this has really helped people and shifted some of their thinking.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a great example, is because the idea of a team that's another small visible system. Is I imagine that you're probably, I mean, you're used to working remotely, doing with people distributed, but I imagine that everybody's coming to those remote meetings, initially at least, with a slightly different view of what does it mean to connect? How does connection matter? Why does it matter? How does it matter right now as opposed to having mattered before? Like, and it's recognizing the dynamism. And so once you get a handle on that changing language, and what happens, I think, is a good effective teams, and there's some evidence around this, is that they build a cadence and a rhythm in their language so that when things change, their language changes too. And then what it means is you can kind of expand your visible system to saying, well, what about our partner organizations? How can we better communicate with them? Because we have a shared language for us. How can we help them build a shared language for them? And then we can build a shared language together and be better at saying, like even those simple questions, how are you doing? Well, that's a different question. It's the same question, but it's a different question now than it was just even a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. So let's pivot slightly and look at our next kind of conversation topic, which is really the theme of this webinar, right? And so if we think about small visible systems, and then we think about the power of the individual, what does it mean? And, you and I have been musing back and forth around this question, but from your perspective, what does it mean for the individual to shift the system?
Yeah, well, so I think one of the things that this has done is that, and it's not just about this. I mean, this was before, the before times sort of thing, but now it's just more amplified. But what it is that understanding who you are within the varying systems that you're a part of. You're part of a family, a neighborhood, a community, an organization, multiple organizations, and that sort of thing. But I think one of the things that it's doing is that when you have all of this complexity, is that it also means that understanding, sometimes we can take a little too much of ourselves out of the equation and put it onto the team. As long as the team's doing all right, well, that's okay because, my team's all right. Well, now we're seeing a situation where, you might have a team of 10 people. Everybody's experiencing something different. I mean, you'll have people for whom are a little more introverted. This pandemic has a certain meaning for them that is different than if you're much more gregarious and social. Some people prefer technology. Some people really just are really trying to get up to speed on this. So what I think it means for systems is being able to anchor to some of those skills and abilities and tendencies that we have. And what it's doing is it's making things a lot more visible. So if I want to make a change, like what I find so interesting is some of the dialogue that I've started to see online and in various communities about, like, people, for example, for saying this is the introverted moment. If you're somebody who's able to who finds some stability and comfort in less social interaction, they're actually really taking up a lot of charges here. Like they're having a leadership moment that often gets, I think, unfairly pushed on those who are a bit more extroverted kind of thing. That's a bit of a mislabeling at times, but there's people who are much more comfortable being in large groups and face to face. There's certain interactions that we've designed as organizations and networks that amplify those positive qualities about being an extrovert. Well, in this case, we're starting to see things from introverts who are doing some really interesting stuff because they feel a lot more comfortable taking some leadership now because it's playing to some of their strengths, if you will. And that's a great opportunity that this is, unwittingly presented to us. That's one example. But the other thing is that I think what it's also doing is because we are in this unusual situation of having to question everything, in the sense is like, what does it mean to have a community right now? What does my neighborhood mean? What does my family mean? we're asking really interesting questions now. And what it's doing is giving us a little bit of freedom to be able to ask those questions differently. And we're coming up with different answers. And because I'm not the only one asking it, you're asking it, you know, our guests are asking it of themselves. You've got this amazing amount of people who are asking questions, whereas before it was a few of us. And it was just me, but it was like, you know, some people get more philosophical in that. So I think that's one of the things that it means for shifting systems, is that we're now creating some opportunities for asking questions and having some real conversations. Like, again, I'll come back to the answer of how are you doing? I know that doesn't mean what it used to. I really think a lot about when I ask somebody, how are you doing? Because I'm preparing for, you know, a little bit of a conversation, you know, about what that means, which is great. You know, I think there's something really positive in that, but it starts to change what we learn, what we know, and then I think what we can do, you know, within a systems context.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think it is also being open to hearing positive and negative, right? Which actually leads us nicely into the next question. And, you know, I think what we've observed is sometimes communities and individuals, and you've mentioned this already, get frozen, right? They're so overwhelmed by the system or the complexity or COVID. And so it's really a question of how do we listen to what people say when we ask them, how are you doing? And they go, good. And you go, no, how are you doing? But then how can we help them move beyond, you know, this notion of fear or, you know, this notion of being frozen?
Absolutely. Well, you know, some of the great work, you know, I would encourage people who are really interested in more complexity oriented thinking. Some great work by Jennifer Garvey Berger. I don't know if you know of her work, but she writes really accessibly, and she talks a lot about listening and the idea of listening to win, the idea of trying to you know, to kind of make a point, listening to fix, which is, you know, how do I solve a problem? And then listening to learn. And I think right now, like honestly, I don't know what a win means right now with a lot of things. I used to have some ideas, and I don't claim to say I've always been the greatest listener. I try my best, but you know, but listening to fix, oh man, I'm terrible at that. A lot of us are, you know, we want to fix things. How can I help? How can I be of service? But the listening to learn is really sitting in there and saying, you know, how can I, you know, what's actually going on here? What's actually happening? What, you know, and doing that together. And I think, for example, even if we take, for example, that, you know, the question that you've asked, some of that is recognizing in ourselves, asking what it is that we're doing. And you know, one example might be the phenomenon of people baking a lot more now. And, you know, like, why am I baking? Not because I think we've got a shortage of baked goods out there, but people are trying to create some form of control, influence over something. I think it's also a lot of creative, you know, people are thinking, well, I have a chance to create something. I can't create what I normally do because I don't have access to the tools or the people or the community or the, you know, that sort of stuff. But I might be able to create bread. And it allows me a chance to play a little bit. It allows me a chance to experiment. It allows me a chance to fail, you know, that kind of thing. And I think that's one of the reasons why we do it. So that movement beyond fear is part of it, is just saying, you know, it's okay. Because I'm sure, like most people I know personally, you know, I'm afraid of baking. I'm an okay cook, not a great baker. I don't follow the rules really well. but you know, what a great thing to learn. Hey, I did this. I've done something. I've created something that I can do. And this, like, the smallest visible system idea is starting to learn how to gain a little bit more mastery. Not crazy about that term in this context, but a little bit more control, a little bit of influence, saying, okay, I think I understand what's going on locally. And it gives you a little bit of confidence. And then, you know, it allows you to say, I can't control what's going on with this pandemic. I can't control what's going on with the economy. I might not even be able to control what's going on with my job, but I can influence this. I can be good to my neighbors. I can do something like this because I'm more mindful of it. So I think, but as you start to do that, and doing this with some compassion, being able to say, you know, What's the smallest thing that I can affect? And then trying to sort of build it out. And I like to think that the better we get at those things, the easier it will be when we're able to start to tackle some of those bigger things in the ways we might have been able to, before this happened.
Thanks so much, Cameron. And I just wanted to note, I've been watching the chats appear, and you went by Jennifer's name really quickly, but Duncan was able to find a link to her online. And so now those of you that want Jennifer's name and maybe a link to some of her work about listening, just go into the chat box and it's there. And thanks to Lisa and others for bringing that up.
Terrific. Yeah. Thank you, Duncan.
Yeah, and so the next question that we have is really about horizons of change, right? And I think sometimes, when you and I were chatting, we think about, the things over the long term, and the long term seems quite daunting. And, it's almost like systems, right? We think about systems as too big as opposed to the smallest visible system. So how can a three horizons viewpoint or an approach really be helpful in contributing to, influencing systems or navigating systems?
Well, and one of the biggest things that we can always with systems change is the idea that one of the most powerful things we have for leverage is mindset, changing our mindset, and three horizons thinking is a mindset and as well as a tool set as well. It's a great tool, and it's also a bit of a trap. And I think that if you can go into it understanding where it works well and where it's a trap, it can be very, very helpful to you. So one of the things it's useful for is, for those of you who don't know, is that the idea is it's talking about it as we see innovations come, or, innovations is just something new, a new trend, it may be a new technology, it could be a social something, is that there's often, it starts somewhere. And we often know about the Everett Rogers, the normal curve, the laggards, the innovators, that sort of thing. And it sort of builds a little bit on that, is the idea that we have these new ideas that are sort of pockets of the future, as sometimes futurists like to think, that are happening right now. And then eventually they will become the dominant. And a great example is Zoom. I don't know how many of us, were using Zoom beforehand. Some of us were, but I know a lot more are, as we were talking about before our chat today. That, for example, the idea of remote work, it's been going on for it's been going on for a long time, 20 years or more. But now all of a sudden we're seeing a moment. Now, I don't know whether that's going to continue, but I can almost be pretty confident that it's going to continue in a much greater extent than it was before the pandemic, even if it's not the most dominant thing. We're now thinking a little bit about how do we work remotely and that sort of thing. And it really comes down to a perceptual shift. So where it can be helpful in contributing to systems change is starting to think a little bit about not just where we are, but what are those little things that are sort of pocketing, those pockets that are coming up that we're starting to see become a little more. We're doing a little more of this, a little more of this, a little more of this. If you think about policy as another example, we've been talking about housing for decades. Well, now all of a sudden we're talking about housing in a way that we haven't talked about it in generations, about housing policy and poverty policy and the role of food banks. Now, normally it doesn't happen this fast, but it's been gaining momentum over years. And what this has done is really started to explode. So all of a sudden, when you start to see it, if you have this three horizons thinking, you start to go, that didn't come out of nowhere. That actually came from a lot of work, and people were ready for that. Again, even if they didn't know it was a pandemic, they were ready for a moment to talk about this. And we've seen, Tamarack is a great example of that. Organizations who've come up and said, we actually have the research, we have the organizations, we have the capacity to start to talk about this in a serious way when everyone else is ready to listen to it. So that's really one of the big things that I think that's very helpful. So what I would tell people on the call is that, start to think of, like, even right now, even though it's a bit of an unusual time, what are some trends that we're starting to see? Like maybe that creative outlet in baking. I mean, that's a kind of a benign thing, but what does that mean? What does that mean for us? I've got a couple slides. Maybe we could just, if you want to take a look at this in terms of perception. And part of the problem is where three horizons comes in is that oftentimes we think it's obvious when it happens, but we don't realize that somebody had to see things differently. So this is, for those of you who can see it who are on the computer, this is from Edgar Degas. And so this was quite a famous painting. He did a few of them, these things about a rehearsal, and it was ballerinas. Now you might look at this painting and you might think, oh, that's really interesting. But we often forget that these things are of their time. So if you notice in the top left-hand corner, you see girls coming down the staircase and their legs are cut off. Prior to this, almost nobody ever did that. And the reason for that was something else was happening around 1870, and that was the advent of the film camera. The cameras were around since about 1825, but even then, most people didn't have access to a camera. Most times people didn't see a picture. They may have seen a couple of pictures. And usually when you saw one, it was set up and it was really orchestrated because the technology was rare and all that sort of stuff like this. Well, now when we think about cameras, we cut stuff off all the time. I mean, we have things on our phone here, like we just go like this, and, you know, it doesn't really matter. But what he did is he actually painted. Rather than frame the entire image, he framed part of the image. This was a radical view. And that was one of the reasons why this painting got so much attention, was because all of a sudden people are like, oh, it's a perspective. The perspective had changed. Just to use another example, if we go to the next slide, is if you think about perspective is that, you know, probably because hopefully some of us have been able to get out at least a little bit and take a look up at the stars, and you look up at all of that and you go, wow, that's really quite incredible. But if we go to the next slide, at some point, some storytellers started to think, hey, there's some links. These are, for example, some of the stars that are out there and the names that have been given. Well, at some point, somebody had started to connect them together and go, oh, hey, look, it's a person. And then if we go to the next slide, it's Orion. We start to see that. Now, that is a perceptual shift. And now we have, you know, thousands of years, people have looked up and said, oh, there's Orion, Orion's belt and stuff like that. Yeah, you know, from a different perspective, sure, I guess that's Orion's. It could have easily been something else. We could have put together a bunch of different stars. So right now we have a chance to sit back and go, what if it's something else? Maybe it's Liz's hat instead of Orion's belt, or I don't know, or something like that, some other constellation of things. And so we're right now really in that opportunity where we have a chance to relax a little bit. I hope emotionally and physically in that, but even just relax a little bit of our assumptions and start to see some of these perceptions that are different. And yeah, maybe we may come up with different things. We may come up with the same things, but it's a chance for us to do something different.
It's kind of interesting. It's almost like we have to zoom in and zoom out, you know? So looking up at the stars is kind of like zooming out, but then looking at Orion's belt is like zooming in, right? And so it's about noticing, I think, what you're saying or what it means to me. So I have another question for you, just to give someone, maybe those listeners on the call, a little bit of a practical example that you have about when you've seen an individual really have pretty big impact and shift a system, and what that actually looks like.
You know, I think I've actually like so many different examples of this, and although it's funny because as I started to think a little bit about this, is that often I'm a little reluctant to want to throw out some of the, you know, the more high profile ones, because oftentimes we have to think, oh, well, you have to be a big, you know, a celebrity to you know, to know how to do this stuff, or you have to be, you know, it's like if you think about, you know, people that have made some big major changes, but one of the persons that I think actually did an amazing job of that and continues to do that is Rick Hansen. So if you think about Rick Hansen, is we take for granted now the idea that he went around the world. I mean, you think about what a ridiculous idea that was. Here's somebody who's in a wheelchair, who is unknown to most people outside of his friends and family and caregivers, and says, you know what, I think what I'm going to do, I've taken some inspiration from another innovator, Terry Fox, who said, you know what, I'm on wheels. He had to run. I'm on wheels. I'm going to actually go around the entire world in my wheelchair. And his vision was really around this idea about was multifold. One, obviously, to raise some awareness of and funds for spinal cord injury research, but it was also to raise the awareness of what a disability was, a physical, and to show that, we're not as limited as we think. But what's so interesting about it is that he would often say is we cannot do this alone. So it was an interesting juxtaposition between him as an individual and the community that he was a part of. And so he was always encouraging people to do it as well as socially. That's one example. But another great example, perhaps, of people shifting systems, and there's such an interesting story about this, is Yvon Chouinard, who founded Patagonia. And there's a lot of interesting story about him trying to create better tools for individuals while having a gentle effect on the planet. And what's interesting about him shifting the system is that what I like about that case is that what he's done is that Patagonia, I don't know how much people know about that, but right now they're one of the most successful outerwear companies in the world, and they struggle with this. So how is it that you're trying to get people to use less, do less, have less impact, and then you're creating some consumer goods that, at some point are going to end up in a landfill? But it's an interesting, but one of the things that he's done is that by being successful in this and getting people to think about, you can resew, like they actually have a program where you can actually send things back to get repaired. He's changing the system a lot. So you actually have some of these other clothing retailers starting to think, geez, maybe we need to make things that are a little bit more sustainable. Maybe we need to think about where do we get things, because and it's by no means a straightforward thing. Like they struggle from a values perspective of whether they're doing the right thing. But I often think that's an interesting example of something about doing the right thing, doing some small changes here and there, where they've been able to change the system. And he never set out to create a multinational company. It's really interesting to hear his story, but he did, and he did it by doing it one piece of clothing at a time, and with a small group, and they started to create products and services. So those are a couple of examples of people who've done that on a big level. And I guess maybe I'd say one more, I don't want to take up too much time, but I often think of teachers. Teachers are great at teaching, at creating systems change. They're not always the best at changing the education system. And I say that with the most respect to teachers. It's hard to change that system. But if you think about what it's done for their students, when you think about people who've gone out, who've been inspired by having somebody who's taught them as a human and respected them and given them a chance to learn something, those are the people that go out and change things. And so that's another example. I often think we can make some of the best systems change by being good teachers.
And that's really the smallest possible system, right? Is the system within the classroom, and how do you create the best environment within that system for all the kids, despite their, economic status or their cultural status, or, so it's kind of interesting that we're almost at the end of the conversation, but it actually ties really nicely into that notion of smallest visible system. The final question that I have, and I know we have some questions in the chat box, so we're going to go to those in a minute. So I'll ask you to be maybe a little bit shorter here.
Sure.
And continue to put questions in the question and answer box, folks that are on the call. And I've been watching your little chats come up, and there's a really incredible online conversation. Someone talked about making a quilt with some of their Patagonia items. So
that's great.
That's kind of a cool idea. But so what specific advice would you have for the folks on the call and others about leaning into their personal powers? So, just all the things that you're thinking about, and then really being maybe a little bit big picture and maybe even a little bit practical.
Sure. So I think there's some simple things that people can do. One of the biggest ones is just simply pay attention. Take a mindfulness orientation to what's happening right now. And by that, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to go and sit and meditate. If that works for you, I think that's great. But is just have mindful moments. So, we have at least a little bit of room. Not everybody has a lot of time, but our time is often, for most of us, has shifted so much in whatever that means for us, is that it creates a little bit of a chance to be just a little bit mindful. So it's a great chance to ask some questions. Why do I do that this way? What am I doing right now? Another great one, just to chase that a little bit, is this idea about energy. And, when we get into habits, Kurt Levine, the psychologist, often talked about, big change comes when you have a frozen system that's pretty stable. And then all of a sudden something happens, new knowledge, crisis or something, and you unfreeze the system, and then you refreeze it. Well, we've got a lot of unfreezing right now. And one of the questions is this recovery is, what were we going to freeze it back into? I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting thing, but it gives us a chance just to ask a few questions about where's our energy. So what excites you? What gets you afraid? What turns you on in an intellectual, social, spiritual way, whatever that is for you. This is a great time to do that, because everything's so disrupted, work patterns, mobility and stuff. It gives us a chance to really ask some of those questions. So I would say that's one of the big things to do. And then the last thing is that, I would say that to scale this up is that this is a leadership moment. And one of the great things about leadership is leadership only works on feedback. So, if people don't follow you, that's not leadership. Right? Or if you don't follow your own ideas, you're not showing personal leadership. So it's a great chance for us to come back to those things that people are stepping up that maybe never did. This is a great chance to have leadership, to see, what are you following? Who are you following? And then what can you do that might help people follow? Like, maybe you're the calm voice in the room when everybody's feeling a little agitated. Maybe you're the person who says, I can step up and maybe I can deliver some meals to someone. Or maybe I've got a new idea. Maybe we could do that. So it's great feedback, because if nobody follows you, well, that's not necessarily leadership. That's no fault of your own. But if people do, it says something's going on. And it gives us a chance to, again, build that shared language to be able to do that. So I would say, really, this is the big chance for you to give yourself a bit of permission to say, what else can I do? What kind of life do I want to live? What kind of community do I want to have? What turns me on? What turns my family and my neighbors on? And then maybe what can I do? How could I be a leader? And that doesn't have to be a big thing. It could be really small, but it could be, there's a great chance for us to do something different here. Partly because we have to, but also we could be more intentional about it.
Kathy added on to your final thought, and who do I want to do this with? Which is kind of interesting, right? So it's not only where can I step up, but who do I also want to step up with? And I think that's a really important point, Kathy, is that, doing it with others actually gives it a little bit more cement, right? And gives it a little bit more context. So now we're going to move into the question and answer period. And we know that the conversation has been really active. And so thank you for that. But I'm going to throw it over to my colleague, Duncan, who's been monitoring the questions. And so maybe, Duncan, you can just bring forward a couple of questions, and we'll have Cameron answer them.
Absolutely. Thanks, Liz and Cameron. And just as a reminder to everyone on the call, if you go to the bottom of your Zoom panel, you'll see a Q&A panel. And if you just ask your questions there, we'll be sure to try to answer it. You can also use the thumbs up feature to vote on which questions you want to see answered. The first question is from Brianna. They ask, I can't help but see the synergies between this and how to help people move past feeling overwhelmed about climate change. I'm wondering how we can combine these different crises so we try to solve multiple crises without overwhelming the individual.
That's a great question, Brianna. I think one of the things that there's been a lot of talk about drawing parallels between this and climate change. And I think some of them are useful and some of them might be asking a lot. The one thing that we have in this case is we have an invisible, visible threat, which is unusual. Climate change is so big that it's a bunch of different threats and they're all threaded together and that sort of thing. But I don't think that that's a reason we can't build on this. I think if we think about that idea of a small visible system, one of the things is to sit and think a little bit about what are the things that you can do right now that's making a difference. Because what's interesting is that climate change is really interesting because we can do some small things locally, but as we start to build a bit of understanding, we can start to jump and go, wait a second, this really works. There's another group that's doing something really similar. Now we're able to talk a little bit differently. We might be able to scale up our vision. You're kind of that idea about who are we going to do this with? It makes that a lot easier. One of the challenges that has been beset the climate change issues is that it's so big, and people, just like they are now, are feeling a bit lost. Is you want to try and create something that can build, you can start to see you're doing something. And I know it feels kind of terrible. You're thinking, well, I'm just doing a small little thing. But the more small things we do, it might allow us to better see how we can link to other small things, which all of a sudden then scales it up. We might be able to see the system in a different way because we've got a new language to talk about how our small things might relate to a bigger thing.
It's interesting, I don't know if you read the paper, Cameron, that we published at Tamarack by Tim Broadhead, who was the former CEO of the McConnell Foundation. And he was talking about not letting another crisis go to waste. And he was talking about the pandemic, but he thought back to the 2008 financial crisis. And his notion was that we actually did let that financial crisis go to waste. For the most part, we came back, businesses came back. Some people profited a lot, but we really didn't learn a lot of lessons. And although he did notice that in the innovation sector, there became a conversation around impact investing, right?
Yeah.
And so he was in that paper looking at, what are some of the patterns that he was observing for the pandemic, the voice of community, the ability of government to make quick decisions, the, the inequity that we're now seeing, this notion of essential workers and things like that. And I think, we want to, particularly with the climate crisis, we want to look at this and start to say, okay, so what are the patterns that are coming out of the pandemic and which of them relate to the climate crisis, right? So the fact that government can come forward and make decisions really quickly, how do we lean into that for the, the climate crisis? What are those patterns and how do we amplify them? And I think that that's a really interesting way of looking at this as well.
Yeah. And, the nice thing about that is that he reminded us of that, that there are some things that are resonant today that made sense back then. Climate change may be the other one, is to say, listen, we actually do know how to handle some of this. We've been here before. The same thing right now, like most of the things that we're facing individually, we've all experienced. We've all had moments of these things. We've had them in little pieces. And what this is allowing us to do is maybe start to thread them together in a way and go, wait, that's sort of that taking the small and making it big by saying we actually did have some lessons there that maybe we didn't learn, but the lessons are still there. If we go back and see how they're repeating themselves here, maybe we have a chance to do something different. Yeah.
So Duncan, another question?
Yeah, thank you both. That's a really great conversation there. The next question comes from Tanya, but is reflected in the chat a little bit as well. Would you be able to explain the three horizons thinking a bit more for those who aren't familiar with the concept?
Sure. Liz, do you want me to go over it? Or do you want to? I'm happy to speak to that.
You go over it, and we'll include in the post email a link to either an article that you've done, maybe Cameron, on Three Horizons, but also on some additional Three Horizons resources.
Yeah. So what the three in just to be kind of brief and without having the visual in front of us, really what it is that to say that there's sort of a dominant trend right now. There's things that we're doing right now that are starting to that are just starting to fade away. And one of them might be certain trends, like, so for example, people have been talking about in retail, talking about department stores. Department store business has been going down for a while. It may be something that's on the decline. I don't want to predict anything, and then sort of on the upswing has been, the rise of more small boutique things. So you've got the dominant horizon, which is the thing that's sort of drifting away right now. You have what the current trend is towards more, chains or just small shops. The third horizon is the future, and the future might be the trend towards some type of online way of doing things. So it doesn't mean that, the thing is, you can have all three of those things all happening at the same time. But one is sort of on the decline, one is sort of the majority, sort of the current trend, and then the other one is the little pockets of things that are happening. And what it does is it talks about things are always in flux. So there's always a new thing. So if I'm just using a speculative example, if online becomes the norm, maybe what's the next trend? Maybe it's going to be a resistance to that. Maybe saying, oh, we can do something that's not online or a blended thing. I don't know. But that's kind of what it is. It's to say that you've got these sort of three major trends that are happening simultaneously that might be going on within a particular sector or a particular issue or something like that.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting if we use the online example, right? I think the trend was to get everybody online really quickly as we all went into our home work environments. And then I think we might get into a little bit of fatigue, right? Of webinar fatigue or workshop or online learning fatigue. And then do we have this next horizon of boutique experiences, and what would that look like, right? And so it's actually interesting. We had the conversation this morning with our team at Tamarack about what those potentials could look like, and how do we look at that kind of further horizon as we think about, the way we're doing online learning and how that might, how we might be able to have that further horizon.
Absolutely. Well, the blended learning. Yeah, the blended learning might be the emergent horizon. So right now, if we take education, it's the face-to-face, and now it's being sort of supplanted by online because of circumstance. And the new one might be, once we get a chance, that blended thing where you have a mix, where you come to an event and you expect to do some stuff on a computer or tablet or something like that. And, that's a great example. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I think we have time for one more quick question, Duncan.
Yeah, our last question comes from Mike, and it has been echoed in a few other questions as well, regarding how systems tend to resist change. So how do we push systems to support the individuals that they're designed to support in the first place?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great question, Mike. And I think one of the word I'm going to lock in on is the designed part, is that we often do a lot of design and we don't realize we're doing it. We're not less intentional. We realize, oh, we created this. Like most of what we're dealing with is we created. Not everybody had a voice. Not everybody had the power. Not everybody had a chance to do it. But not always were we even conscious of doing it. We just kind of kept rolling into something. Depends on the circumstance. But I think one of the questions right now is to think about, there is a lot of resistance. What we have right now, though, is what's interesting about our current situation is that so many subsystems are being disrupted. The economic one, the social one, government is being disrupted. I mean, we're all facing that. And what it does is it means that if we want to put things back together, not even back together, I don't even know if that is even the thing. When things start to settle, we have a chance right now to be conscious about, do we couple things together? Should we be thinking about social policy around, I'll use the example I used earlier, housing. What does it mean now that if home is now more than just a place you live, but it might also be a workplace, how does that change our social policy and how we support people in affordable housing? What does that mean? Like, for example. So it gives us a chance to start to think about what kind of couplings do we want to do. Streets, we're starting to see the Seattle, Oakland have started to just in Milan, get rid of car traffic, because they've said, you know what, maybe this is our chance to be more active. We've wanted to do it for a long time. Now we have a chance to do that. So I think really what this is that this is where it's being mindful on these things around individuals and going, what's important to me? And it's easy to go, what's important to everybody. But if you start to think about what's important to you and having conversations to see what's important, where you can build that shared experience and build things with people. Because you might find there's other people who are like, yeah, this is important to me too. So that you can start to build those kind of pockets and then start to see where those little clefts are, those little spaces between systems. Because that's really where the change happens. And then we can start to think about, how do we design that together? I mean, that's a big, I know that's a lot, but it's often ways to see things, because right now everything's kind of upheaval. Like all you have to do is turn on the TV. who would have thought we'd be spending days watching, you know, our political leaders and public health people and economists every day on the news, but they're all talking about how these some of that.
Okay, you froze for a second there, but that's good. It's good. I think we got the sense of your talk or your thoughts. So Duncan, I know we have a couple of minutes left, so why don't we turn it over to you to do the last little wrap up. But before we do that, Cameron, I want to thank you. I think this has been a really interesting conversation. I also want to really thank everybody who's online with us today, and for your thoughts and your comments in the chat box, your questions. We're going to be sending you some follow-up information, and we're keeping this discussion going, because I think it is really fascinating to think about, you know, how we have this big potential to shift systems, and sometimes we do it with intent, and sometimes it just happens. And so I think having what I take from you today, Cameron, is the more intention we can put behind it, the more design we can put behind it, the more impact we will have.
Yeah, I think
wonderful. Thank you
nice
both.
Summary.
Yeah. So with that, we're going to start wrapping up the webinar here. I just wanted to thank both of you for leading us through this discussion, and again, for everyone on the call for sharing your thoughts and resources and links. That's greatly appreciated. Our first announcement is that through May, we're committed to bring you free weekly community building webinars to help equip you for community change as we all adjust to this new normal. Join us for discussions on things like systems change, collective impact, how the arts can impact community change, and much, much more. Just through the chat, I've been seeing some familiar names that we've seen on past webinars, so thank you to everyone who's been joining us for these. It's been a really great experience. As well, in a few days, you'll receive our follow-up email, which will include a link to the audio recording of today's call, as well as a video recording, and as well as the learning opportunities we've just talked about. As well, once you leave this webinar, you'll be prompted to do a short survey. We really encourage you to provide your feedback so that we can continue to improve these webinars. If you'd like to learn more about upcoming webinars and learning opportunities, you can visit us at tamarackcommunity.ca. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for joining.